The poorest state in America currently has a higher per capita GDP than Britain. Cheap energy. Mississippi didn't go in for any of that green nonsense. All of the Boris Johnson, Carrie Johnson nonsense that has wrecked the British economy. Mississippi pretty much sidestepped. Mississippi doing everything that Milton Friedman would want you to do. We have poor productivity, declining per capita GDP, a sense that the country is coming apart culturally. Every administration since Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, heaven help us, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, they all believed in the same essentially three Blairite assumptions. Number one.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I am absolutely delighted to be joined by the wonderful Douglas Carswell. Douglas is the President and CEO of the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, an American think tank working to advance the ideas of limited government and free markets. Prior to his work in Mississippi, Carswell served as a Member of Parliament here in the UK for 12 years and co-founded Vote Leave, the official campaign that secured victory in the 2016 EU referendum. Douglas also sits as an advisory council at the Advisory Council here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Douglas, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to first of all talk a little bit about the story and the success story that is the state of Mississippi, going from, well, it's still sort of one of the poorest states in the United States, but still in a GDP increasing and overtaking the UK. I think it's also predicted to overtake Germany at some point this year as well. What's happened in Mississippi?
A lot of your listeners, when they hear the word Mississippi, will think of a rather impoverished state, probably think of the river, probably think of a riverboat and cotton fields and maybe some guy strumming a banjo on a broken porch. That couldn't be more out of date. Mississippi may still be the poorest state in America, but not for much longer. It is beginning to really grow. There has been more economic growth in Mississippi in the past 5 years than in the previous 15. In other words, if you would compare it to the UK, it's almost the precise opposite of the UK. We've got accelerated productivity and accelerated growth. Per capita GDP in Mississippi overtook the UK 2 years ago. So the poorest state in America currently has a higher per capita GDP than Britain. And the really exciting news is that we're about to overtake Germany in per capita GDP growth terms this year. Now, some of your listeners may say, what about purchasing power parity? Actually, if you take into account purchasing power parity in the United States, Mississippi is almost certainly considerably above Germany already, because a dollar in Mississippi buys far more than it would in New England or wherever. So why is this? I think there are three big reasons why Mississippi is becoming a success story. Number one, tax reform. In 2022, the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, the think tank that I advocate for, published a bill with a bit of help from others that became law, and it created a flat rate income tax. We had an income tax that very roughly was 7%, 4%, and 2%, and we created it into a flat 4% as a precursor to full elimination. If you're interested in eliminating taxes, make sure everyone has skin in the game, make them flat. That's the way to do it. And sure enough, 6 weeks ago, I'm delighted to say we finally passed a bill that will eliminate the income tax in Mississippi completely by 2037. So the reform that we introduced in 2022 to create the flat tax began to attract investment and capital. It reduces very significantly the cost of a business doing business in Mississippi. Basically, the payroll costs are significantly cheaper now. The second major reform we introduced, I'm talking about in order of importance, not chronologically. The second most important reform we've seen in Mississippi was in 2021, radical labor market deregulation. In Mississippi, it's a so-called at-will employment state. So you can leave a job as you wish, when you wish in Mississippi, and conversely, you can fire someone. It's a totally flexible labor market. And we had a whole bunch of occupational licensing restrictions in Mississippi, so that you needed a permit to do pretty much anything. We introduced an occupational licensing reform in 2021 that dramatically reduces the burden of occupational licensing restrictions. So low taxes, a deregulated labor market, and then third, and I think really important, cheap energy. Mississippi didn't go in for any of that green nonsense. All of the Boris Johnson, Carrie Johnson nonsense that has wrecked the British economy, Mississippi pretty much sidestepped, meaning that energy prices are really low in Mississippi. And because of all of this, we're now seeing huge investment. We've had over $20 billion, billion, not million, of investment announced in the past 9 months in Mississippi in data centers. That is pretty phenomenal in a state of 3 million people. So Mississippi, for the first time in living memory, is a net importer of people. We're getting rapid economic growth. I think rather like Ireland in the 1980s, having been held back by cartel politics for years, simply getting rid of a lot of the restrictions leads to this exponential catch-up. And we're seeing that in Mississippi, and it's exhilarating to be part of it. I could also say that the quality of some of the immigrants to Mississippi might have something to do with it as a Brit, but that would be facetious.
Someone like yourself. It's absolutely fascinating, and it's so remarkable to see so much change in such a short space of time. And it really does, I think, demonstrate the real impact that the state taking a step back, that actually, if you ensure that the taxation system is much simpler, as well as the burden being low across the board. I mean, the fact that income taxes, congratulations, first of all.
Thank you.
And the fact that income tax is going to be eliminated altogether by 2037, I think is just absolutely remarkable.
We'll be the first state, apart from oil-rich Alaska, that had an income tax that abolishes it. And I think that is really exhilarating. People often look at America and they say, you've got these different, the laboratory, the experiment. You can look at different states. It's fascinating to be part of a real live experiment. Mississippi doing everything that Milton Friedman would want you to do, almost. We're still not there on school choice and one or two other things. And seeing the results. Mississippi is on the rise.
And just specifically with tax, what is the case with other taxes? I mean, with corporation tax or with consumption taxes, what does it look like across the board? And is there a balance to be struck? And where is that missing revenue come from? Have they resulted in cuts in public spending?
Well, we're going to have to find a significant chunk of money to make up for the lost revenue from income tax. And what's really interesting is that the people in the legislature who spearheaded the campaign to eliminate the income tax were quite open about it, almost Thatcherite in outlining the principle, which is that taxation should basically be on consumption and property taxes. It doesn't make sense to tax income. So they're not going to get rid of all taxes. The burden of taxation will be on property taxes and consumption. So there will be a slight reduction straight away in the consumption tax on groceries, but taxes on consumption, sales tax, is going to be the sort of the mainstay of revenue collection. But in order to make up the shortfall from lost income on income tax, you're going to have growth. And that's why when we passed the bill to eliminate the income tax, we were very careful to create a series of so-called tax triggers. So there's a modest budget surplus in Mississippi. Every year that there will be a modest budget surplus, a portion of that budget surplus will be used to eliminate the income tax. So we need the growth. Without the growth, you won't get the budget surplus. And without the budget surplus, you can't eliminate the income tax. But once you get that virtuous circle of modest budget surpluses, lowering taxes and growth, where does the revenue come from? It comes from all those extra consumers that are going to be moving to Mississippi and being born in Mississippi and buying houses in Mississippi and working in Mississippi. That's how you create the revenue that government understandably is needed to do some of the things that government needs to do.
And it's fundamentally growing the size of the pie, I suppose, in many ways, right? The fact that the tax receipts are able to actually increase as a result of that is because you've got that economic growth. I mean, it truly is fascinating. Congratulations for such a short space of time you're able to achieve so much. And let's talk specifically about school choice, because I read a couple of articles very recently comparing the educational attainment levels in Mississippi, where effectively a lot of people were talking about the fact that Mississippi have quite a bad reputation for educational attainment, especially when it comes to Black students that have attained incredibly low levels, especially when it comes to maths and English, and their reading levels were reading age was a lot higher than other states. And that seems to have changed, again, quite dramatically in the last few years. What's happened?
It annoys a lot of my friends in the Midwest when I point out that Mississippi reading standards and math standards are now better in the public school system in Mississippi than in the Midwest. Now, some of this is simply because a decade ago, we had a very enlightened governor, Phil Bryant, friend of Nigel Farage. And Phil Bryant did something very clever. He did something that I think Nick Gibb, the former Tory minister, would understand. He insisted that people use phonics to learn to read. And this focus on phonics has had a significant impact. He also introduced a piece of legislation that meant that if you weren't at a certain standard of reading by third grade, you had to repeat the year. And the combined effect, I mean, to cut through all the educationist blah blah, the reason why you're seeing the improvement in standards in Mississippi is a focus on phonic for reading and making people repeat if they're not at a certain standard by third grade. We've seen some significant improvement in that now, and there are things that other states can do to learn from that. But I think we have to also recognize we've gone about as far as you can in improving the public education system in Mississippi by issuing directives on how you can teach better. Mississippi is now surrounded on four sides by states that have universal school choice. And one of the great untold stories of America is this revolution in education. When I arrived in America 5 years ago, I think there were probably 1.5 states that had school choice. Florida partly and Arizona partly, and West Virginia was about to. Now, 15 or 16 states have school choice, and 10 of those have real universal school choice. So that if you're in somewhere like Arkansas now, the neighboring state to Mississippi, you can, and the average private school fees in Arkansas is about $6,000. If you live in Arkansas, you can contact the state government basically at the beginning of the year and say, I want my $7,000 for my child. And you can then take your child and that money to any school, public or private. If you're happy with the school they're in, great, they stay. If you want to move to a different public school, great, move, provided there's room. And if you want to say, you know what, I'd rather my child was educated outside the government sector altogether, great, fantastic, you can do that. And so you're seeing this revolution in school choice in particularly the southern United States. Now, in Mississippi, we've not yet been able to do this. Some of the forces of reaction have prevented us from doing it. We're partly there. We're laying the groundwork for a school choice revolution in Mississippi. Every child in Mississippi now has a personalized budget, their money, a dedicated number of dollars. We tried this session to make sure that their personal education budget could be fully portable and they could take it anywhere they wanted within the public school system. That was defeated by a reactionary lieutenant governor who doesn't like school choice. But I think, like in Texas, those so-called Republicans who stand in the way of school choice will come to a sticky end.
That's really interesting, especially when thinking about the psychology of it. I mean, so I used to teach children, and I remember teaching phonics very specifically, especially to children that were. I actually had one child who spoke fluent Welsh, who grew up in Wales, but then family moved over to London, and so he had to learn phonics all over again. And so he was a bit older than his peers with that. But it is really interesting, especially when we're thinking about the kind of process of education, but treating education like a market is an entirely separate issue. And actually, when you allow families and individuals to make those choices about the kind of schools that they want, the incentives are exactly the same in education as they are in any other system.
And no two kids are the same. Yes. So why rely on a system of education created in 19th century Prussia on the edge of an industrial revolution, where the whole idea was to create a regimented society? Why in the age of total self-selection, where you can decide what apps you have on your phone, do you have a curriculum for your child that is identical to the kid next to them? It's an insane way of doing it. Give families control over their share of the budget. Create some safeguards if you want. I get that. I sometimes worry that there may be unintended consequences with some of the ESA programs and school choice. But with a few safeguards and a learning experience, you can create a system of mom and dad having control of their share of public tax dollars. And I think it will work much, much better. And it will raise standards. It will mean variety. It will mean choice. We're going to look back. those southern states that have done this are going to look back in 10, 15 years and think, why didn't we do this a generation before?
It's really, really fascinating, especially because the money is following the child. It's actually, I mean, in the UK, technically, we have that system in which money does follow the child. So if one child leaves one school, the money leaves them and goes to the next school that they decide to go to. So we have a very, very subtle element of that. But of course, there is less of a competitive market in education. And I think this does hark back to everything that Milton Friedman argued for in Free to Choose, where he said that actually the state can still fund education. There is still that basic level of money that's being spent on education for each child. But the families are able to choose where they get that money from.
The UK sadly is heading in the wrong direction. There were some good changes introduced by Lord Adonis and Tony Blair in the latter stages of the Blair government. Michael Gove built on those, and it allowed a degree of autonomy from academies and charter schools. I remember having a conversation with Michael Gove when he was in charge of education and we were still in opposition. And I asked him if he would be interested in the idea of school choice, of an American-style school choice program. And he said to me, no, his focus was going to be on what are essentially, he didn't put it in these terms, but what you might call supply-side reform, improving the quality of the schools. And I remember saying to him, if you do that, it will be reversed when you no longer have a majority or when there's no longer an education minister that believes in these things. And sure enough, that's what's happened. There was a significant improvement in teaching standards in the UK thanks to the Adonis, Gove, and let's be honest, Blair reforms. Those have now gone into reverse. The government is now, in effect, removing the autonomy that makes academies successful. I don't know the full detail, but I suspect they will have free schools, charter schools in their sites. Imagine what might have happened if Michael Gove, instead of doing all that, had given every family in the United Kingdom a legal right to request and receive control of their share of local education authority funds. It would be rather like Thatcher giving people the right to sell, to buy a council house. It would create a huge constituent of people with an interest in supporting the centre right on this. And it would be impossible to remove that right once you've given it to them.
Absolutely. And the fact that those families have that incentive to want their children to do the best they possibly can in education means that they're able to put more pressure on teachers, they're able to compete. And fundamentally, that creating that market in education means that schools have an incentive to improve the quality of education.
The argument of favourite school choice is not just utilitarian. It's not just this will raise standards, although it will. It will do a reverse Gramsci. This country has been taken over by a radical left-wing agenda, largely promoted through teacher training colleges and the education system. It has normalized extremist Marxist ideology. The only way you can undo that is by destroying the ability of the state to indoctrinate young people. And the only way to do that is through school choice. I'm afraid we have to add to that very long list of Cameron-era, Gove-era government failures the wasted opportunity to use their majority in Parliament to do any significant reforms. They built on the Adonis reforms, which was great, but as we see, they go into reverse. Conservatives like Michael Gove will often, slightly baffled, I think, wonder why it is that the country has moved, or the official establishment part of the country has moved in such an extremist leftist direction. Well, maybe your failure to give parents control over their children's education for 30 years might have something to do with it.
I think it's really interesting, specifically with education and the way in which things have gone in the UK. I mean, we can look at this from primary schools all the way through to universities, in which, I mean, so many cases, families have no idea what their children are learning. And unless they have that time to instill particular values in their children, it is the teachers and fundamentally the curriculum, the government bureaucrats that are instilling their values in those children.
The bit of my job I like more than any other is to talk about free market ideas and American exceptionalism to young audiences. And we run a program in Mississippi that does that. When I was here in the UK, I used to volunteer to go along and talk about free market economics at schools. Being able to do that for a living it's wonderful. This zeal I have for promoting free market ideas is wonderful. And the reason, Reem, why I find it so extraordinarily rewarding is because so often when you're talking to a group of 15, 16, 17-year-olds about free market ideas, it's the first time they've ever heard it. And you can see in the audience the light bulb go off in their head. When you explain to someone that no transaction happens unless both parties are better off, when you explain to people that the pricing mechanism is a beautiful way of getting someone in Britain and someone on the other side of the planet to cooperate together without ever meeting each other, when they understand that the sheer moral beauty of the free market, they will never see the world again. Yet the tragedy is, Reem, that so often when you have this conversation with young people in Britain, they have passed through years of public education and never had it explained to them, and often been told the opposite. They've often been told that the free market is immoral and it's exploitative, and it's such a tragedy. The only way we can reverse this is through school choice.
Absolutely. I think specifically with regard to the way in which the idea that capitalism, and I think that is the term that's generally speaking used, is evil, that it's exploitative, that it means that adults effectively aren't able to make those choices, and fundamentally it results in inequality. And I do think, I'll quote Thatcher here, the argument that the left would rather the poor were poorer so long as the rich were less rich, I think that's fundamentally true. Inequality as a measurement of economic prosperity is incorrect. The fact of the matter is we can have high levels of inequality, but the poor is still better off. And that's fundamentally what that allows to happen. I spoke at your Leadership Academy in Mississippi last year.
You remember it made quite an impact.
It was very fun. And I spoke about the morality of capitalism. And I think that fundamentally the way in which we think about free markets as a system of consent, I think that argument does land with young people. And I completely share your optimism with that. The fact that when you're able to speak to those young people, we're the first people that they've ever heard talk positively about free markets, is definitely quite rewarding. And I think that the way in which school choice allows families to make that fundamental choice, and you see that market in education flourish. What do you think is the future with Mississippi's education system then? Do you see this occurring? Do you think school choice is going to be implemented?
We've taken step one towards universal school choice, which is to give a personalised budget to every child. That's a precursor to then allowing them to take the money anywhere within the public school system. We're having a special session of the legislature any moment now. And I'm very much hoping that is put on the agenda. If it's not, it certainly will be in 2026. I know that Donald Trump is looking with great interest at school choice in the States. And I am very confident that as and when there is a bill in Mississippi that supports his agenda on school choice, I'm confident that Republicans in the legislature will support that. I think it will happen. I think it will happen. The sooner it happens, the better. I can sit here and I can say, well, it might happen in a year, 2 years, 3 years. Hang on. If you're a 7 or 8 or 9-year-old, it's one heck of a difference as to whether you get school choice now or in 3 years' time. So the sooner we do this, the better.
Absolutely. Well, good luck with that project, Douglas, and I'm sure it'll be very successful. Let's move on to talk about your plan for the United Kingdom. Now, of course, you have extensive experience in politics in the UK. You've been able to really, I think, quite dramatically change the way in which we think about the state and its relationship with the individual. The fact that the state is incredibly bureaucratic. You spoke about the administrative state in the past, and I came across your article this year entitled Milestones, 9 Steps to Restore Britain. Tell us what those 9 steps are and why you think they are the solution to solving Britain's economic crisis.
Well, I'd rather sort of zoned out from UK politics and focused on Mississippi, but I occasionally would glance at my social media feed about the old country and feel this incredible sense of sadness about the condition of the country. Britain is in a pitiful condition. We have poor productivity, declining per capita GDP, a sense that the country is coming apart culturally. And I thought I wanted to do something about this. Now, I sort of slightly lost track of the number of people who said, we need a strategy to deal with this. And so I thought one rainy Sunday afternoon in Mississippi, I thought I'll jot down a few ideas. And I started off from the basic, what is the problem? Britain doesn't just need a change of government. Britain needs a change in how the country's governed. The reason why Britain is in a sorry mess, it's not because people with blue rosettes or red rosettes have been running things. It's because basically for 28 years, almost 28 years ago to the day, Tony Blair was elected. And since then, we've had a succession of Blairite governments. Now, Tony Blair may have only been Prime Minister for the first 10 of those 28 years, but every administration since Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, heaven help us, Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak, they all believed in the same essentially three Blairite assumptions. Number one, they believed in the infallibility of the expert, that you can have the Bank of England set interest rates or the Sage Committee put us under house arrest and it will lead to good public policy. The second assumption they've all had is that you can tax and regulate the economy, but provided you slosh enough monetary stimulus at the economy, you will get growth. That is a disaster. It leaves us with the insane idea that we in a period of supposed economic growth, not that there's much of it, we're running a 5% government deficit. And the third Blairite fallacy is that human nature is interchangeable. This is a sort of radical leftist position that the Blairites have imposed on us. The Blairites, who believe that human nature is interchangeable, believe that a man can become a woman in the most extreme version, or that an Eritrean can become an Englishman. And they make the mistake of therefore thinking that you can allow anyone to come into the country. You don't really need to do anything to integrate the country beyond a few pieties about toleration and, yada, yada, yada. And it's a disaster. It means that you've had economic mismanagement with the Bank of England messing up the economy. It means that you've created a climate change committee that's priced UK energy producers out of the UK being able to be competitive. It means that you've had a series of technocratic failures. And even when you change the government, you end up with a bunch of even more incompetent ministers in charge. And I think the country needs a fundamental change of direction. So I having diagnosed the problem of this Blairite ascendancy and talked about the dissatisfactions, I wanted to set out a strategy to do something about it. It's not enough just to come up with a list of policies. I think the first thing you need to do is recognize that in order for the country to make the changes that are needed, you wouldn't be allowed to do it if you relied on business as usual. If Nigel Farage or Robert Jenrick were to win a parliamentary majority and to walk into Downing Street and try to fix these problems, if they played by the normal rules, they would be defeated. They would be defeated the same way all the rest of them were defeated. So you need fundamentally to use unconventional means. One of these is you need to use so-called orders in council. Donald Trump, when he became president, in the first 3 weeks would sign those executive orders very theatrically. That was very choreographed. That was a lot of deliberate thought as to how to use executive orders to achieve change. There is a British equivalent, orders in council. They can be used to establish control over the civil service, to remove and to re-engineer Whitehall, to reduce the number of government departments. We've currently got 24. I identify in milestones 8 that you could get rid of straight away. In order for an incoming administration to be effective and to do anything other than just issue press releases, you need to remove the cause of the dysfunction at the centre of Whitehall, which is the triumvirate between the Treasury, the Downing Street and the Cabinet Office. You need to create a department of the Prime Minister. And so I set out in detail how you do this, how you use executive orders in council to do it, how you use emergency legislation to do it. You then need to address the judiciary, because the judiciary are a roadblock to the changes the country needs. And I outline how you would use emergency legislation to rein in the judiciary, to amend judicial review, which has basically allowed unelected judges to not only strike down policies that ministers are implementing they disagree with, but actually to tell ministers what they need to do in place. I mean, it's what's happening is quite outrageous. So you need to do those things for an incoming administration to have control. If you don't do that, an incoming administration will end up basically being in office but not in power.
I think it's really, really interesting on this specific point. I mean, so many conversations I've had with members of parliament have been that as soon as they'll have all of these ideas and they'll want to implement them as soon as they get into government, as soon as they become a government minister, they are controlled by the civil servants, by advisors, by various different people. And so as an individual, they don't have the ability to go in and say, this is what we need to do. And even more so, if you are not the kind of person that has a real strategy for, say, you're about to become the Minister for Education, if you don't have a real idea for what you want to achieve, you are just swallowed up by that Whitehall blob. And unfortunately, the same thing just happens over and over and over again.
There are 2 or 3 bits of legislation passed by the Blairite administrations the past 30 years that need to be repealed. Yes. You hear people talking about a great repeal bill. I get that, but actually it can't be done in one bill. You've got to repeal 3 or 4 key bits of legislation. Number one, you've got to get rid of the Equalities Act. The Equalities Act is the opposite of what it says. Far from creating more equality, the Equalities Act overturns the idea in English law that everyone is equal before the law and creates 9 categories of sort of protected, elevated persons. The Equalities Act also does something else that people haven't really picked up on. It gives civil servants a carte blanche excuse not to do what they don't want to do, because they go up to ministers and they say, Minister, this would contravene the Equalities Act. Similarly, the Human Rights Act that incorporates the ECHR into UK law needs to be repealed. That's fairly sort of straightforward. You also need to, incidentally, get rid of the Judicial Appointments Commission and allow the Lord Chancellor to not only appoint judges, but to remove judges who adjudicate from the bench on the basis of what they want the law to be rather than what the law actually is. So there are various Blairite bills that need to be repealed. The Climate Change Act needs to go. Section 127 of the Communications Act needs to go. You need to do all of this. But you also need to do something about the economic condition of the country, because that is dire.
I was going to say, before we move on to specifically growing the economy, and of course we know the government have been talking about economic growth, although a lot of us talking a lot of action, but very specifically about this kind of legislation and the relationship with the judiciary, because I think that there are countless examples of this happening in the UK in which unprecedented interventions in the market have occurred. I mean, one example is the Asda and Next pay dispute, in which effectively the market is working where warehouse jobs aren't as attractive, and so it tends to be the case that men were filling those jobs more than women.
Or Birmingham.
Or indeed in Birmingham City Council. And what had happened is they'd increased the salary in order to try and encourage more people to do it, which then incidentally meant that the men were being paid more than the women, but not for the same work, very crucially. And it was in a court of law that the value of these jobs were being decided. It's one of the most unprecedented interventions in the labour market. And what it does, it signals that a government bureaucrat or indeed a judiciary can decide the value of work rather than the market. It's absolutely insane.
It's absolutely insane. I mean, it almost sort of harks back to the Middle Ages when guilds would determine what the value of labour was. And under English law, we abandoned that sooner than continental Europe, which is one of the reasons why we had a sort of proto-capitalist takeoff in England. The idea that a judge can decide whether or not 2 people should receive a certain wage for doing different functions, it's nonsense. Actually, I'm surprised there's not more anger. I mean, look at Birmingham, our second city. Given the uncollected rubbish in Birmingham, bits of it look like a third world country. Yeah. And this is a direct consequence of DEI judicial activism, where judges have said, you're not paying staff what you should be paying them because of these disparities, gender disparities. And it has made it impossible to run the city council in our second largest city, as a consequence of which rubbish is not being collected. It's a sort of dysfunctional way of running a society. So, I think we need to recognize that a crisis is coming, a conflict is coming, inevitably, between Middle England and parliamentary democracy and a leftist, legalistic judiciary that believes that what they would call the rule of law, it's actually the rule of lawyers, takes precedence over parliamentary democracy. And the fight between the activist Lady Hale in the Supreme Court and Boris Johnson and his government over whether to prorogue Parliament was really the opening salvo in this coming conflict. The country is doomed if the Supreme Court wins. We've got to get rid of the Supreme Court. We've got to treat them, if they want to behave like the Bourbons, we must treat them like the Bourbons. This country will never grow until the Supreme Court building is free of judges and is returned to being Middlesex Crown Court.
This is the Great Repeal. Just reset all legislation back to 1997 and we can start from there.
We must drive these people out of public life.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think very specifically the fact that they've been able to completely overhaul legislation, it also does completely obfuscate parliamentary sovereignty. And it means that what happens within Parliament and what happens with elected politicians, whether you like them or not, they have democratic legitimacy. These people do not. And very specifically on economic growth, I mean, it's really, really interesting. When I was reading your piece in the Telegraph, and I know it's also on your Substack, so listeners to certainly check it out, where you talk very specifically about sort of trying to jumpstart Britain's stagnant economy and the way in which you do that. Now, of course, one thing that I found quite interesting is the narrative around economic growth has certainly shifted. We're no longer in the era in which, Jeremy Corbyn or indeed some of the sort of more hard-left people from The Guardian, think of people like George Monbiot, were saying, no, we don't want economic growth. Those people are very, very clearly in the fringes now, and you're seeing the majority of this Labour government at least talking about economic growth, and yet what they are actually doing physically is increasing regulations in the labour market, increasing taxes, so effectively it means that work is so much more expensive, and so the language is being used of economic growth, talking about it, but what they're actually doing is sort of an entire mismatch. What do you think very specifically about that? Do you think that there are specific steps that can be taken to achieve economic growth? What is that, and how do we actually get there?
I mean, I think governments over the past 10 or 15 years since the financial crisis have basically behaved in a way that to an objective observer would look far left and socialistic. They've de facto nationalized a lot of the banking sector in 2007-8. They hosed a huge wad of artificial credit at the economy to prop up the financial bubble. There is catastrophic malinvestment in the UK economy. One of the reasons why productivity has been so poor in the UK is because of chronic malinvestment. The country is very highly taxed, very highly regulated. You said that they distance themselves from Jeremy Corbyn. I sometimes wonder if this government is doing pretty much what Jeremy Corbyn would want to do. I mean, at a time when we're not in recession, they are spending 5% of GDP on the budget deficit every year. They're running up debt.
Public spending is about to get over 50% of GDP. So the majority of the UK economy will be public spending.
I mean, pre-COVID, public spending as a percentage of UK economic output was 40%. It's now about to reach the level that socialist France used to be in the early noughties. So we have socialized the economy. In Britain, it doesn't matter who you vote for at the moment. You end up with ever more leftist outcomes. That's the fundamental problem.
Can I ask, actually? So I know that, of course, with Reform UK and the relationship that Nigel Farage has had with economic policy within the party has shifted ever so slightly. I mean, I've always taken, and you'll know much more about this than me, but I've always taken Nigel as a instinctive free marketeer. And yet the policies that have been announced by Reform, at least since the election, have been pretty interventionist. I mean,
nationalising British Steel.
Nationalising British Steel, the energy policies that Richard Tice announced. I mean, saying that we're going to subsidise certain sectors, saying that we're going to tax renewable energy, that we're going to force the national grid to put wires underground, which would increase their cost tenfold. I mean, where is this all?
Well, this is actually a great opportunity because the country is being driven into the ground by the Blairite governments that have, despite talking pro-market, have socialised the economy. And all of them have done this to the point where the 50% of GDP, the government spends equivalent to 50% of GDP. You can't open your front door as a businessman in the UK without a permit of some kind. The critique of this offered by Reform seems to be that we need more state intervention to fix problems caused by state intervention. Now, there's an opportunity there, isn't there? I think if you were to come up with some of the ideas in milestones, you would begin to win over people by saying, this is how to fix the economy. And it's totally different to anything the Labour Party will promise, different to anything that I think Reform would promise. I think there are certain things you can do. Number one, you have to get control of public spending. And I set out in detail in milestones how to do that. In a first 5-year term, you could reduce public spending from where it is now back to where it was pre-COVID. You've got to be realistic about it. I budget as to how you can do that. And I've outlined the tax cuts you would need to do that. Now, sadly, you can't achieve that just by abolishing foreign aid. You need to largely abolish foreign aid. Yes, you need to get rid of 8 of the 24 government departments. You also need to address the fact that large numbers of people in Britain are paid through the benefit system to be economically inactive. And you have to address that. You have to change that. You have to take away some of those benefits.
It's a tenth of the adult working population. I mean, it's more than it's a waste of taxpayer money and hard-earned taxpayer money at that. But it's a huge, huge waste of human potential.
Let's not be apologetic about this.
Yeah.
This is, if you accept the moral prism through which the left wants you to discuss this, you're doomed. If you are being paid by the state to sit at home and play video games and eat pizza, you are not leading a purposeful life.
No.
And we should not hold back for a second and apologize remotely for taking your benefits away. Not because we're heartless, but because what a waste of a human life to be paid to sit on your backside like that. Take those benefits away in order for people to have a purposeful life.
Absolutely, especially when a lot of those claims are being made on the basis of mental health. I mean, where is the evidence? Show me the medical evidence that the best thing for a depressed person is to sit on their backside and eat pizza at home.
One of the reasons why I think there is a problem of neurosis in the country, and I think there has been a problem of neurosis, it's partly because of the hysteria over lockdowns. That had a hugely damaging effect on the English psyche. A loss of a sense of purposefulness. People trying to create a moral code by looking at the virtue signals on their Twitter feed are not going to end up happy. In order to improve the mental health of the country, I think the best thing you can do for a lot of people who feel detached and that they've lost direction is to have a job. A job gives you a sense of purpose. As an adult, particularly as a young man, going out and doing a job that earns an income to provide for your other half and your family is a deeply rewarding thing. There is anyone doing that, no one ever doing that can possibly have a bad job.
Yes.
No one can have a bad job. That is, it speaks to a deep part of the human psyche.
Biological part
absolutely,
of the human psyche.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
And if you create a welfare system that creates incentives not to do that, then you are going to have a lot of these problems. So remove the benefits from people. Now, there will be people who, through no fault of their own, are genuinely unable to work. I was a member of Parliament for Clacton for 12 years, and I sat in constituency surgeries dealing with benefit cases. And I know there are people who are genuinely deserving, but also know there are a heck of a lot of people who aren't deserving. You need unashamedly to make that distinction.
I think that's proof in the numbers, right? I mean, there was an NHS Confederation report that was drawn with Boston Consulting Group a couple of years ago that effectively looked at the number of students, the number of people that were economically inactive because they were students, to then being economically inactive because they were signed off as long-term sick. 65,000 people in a single year went from being economically inactive because they were students to then being economically inactive because they were signed off as long-term sick. The proof is there.
Yep. So in milestones, I identify the reforms you need on universal credit payments and PIP payments. Mm-hmm. And I for years in this country, to have this discussion would have to be done through the BBC. And you would always get the BBC person implying that you were heartless and then cutting to a vox pop of someone who was deserving to make... Forget that. We don't need to have that argument through the prism of the leftists. We can level with the British people that it is... If you want your children and your children's children to have a higher standard of living than you have today, you need to address this. You need to stand with us as we cut public spending. Once you've cut public spending, and I set out in detail how to do it, you can begin to introduce tax cuts. Now, I think you've got to be realistic, and I set out how to do this. You need to prioritize, I think, tax cuts in 3 areas. Number one, income tax. I'm a great believer in reducing income tax.
Mississippi.
As in Mississippi. It's an insane thing to tax income. You want people to have a higher income, so why tax them for having an income? Now, sadly, we won't be able to eliminate the income tax in the UK, but you can move towards a flat income tax. And I propose how to do this. I would, in the first term, right away eliminate the 45% threshold. That's revenue neutral. In fact, introducing the 45% threshold has reduced revenue compared to projections. Get rid of the upper band, 45%. Start to raise the 40% threshold from roughly 52,000 to 57,000 over the first 5-year parliament. That would give a tax break to 5 million households. The long-term aim should be to raise the 40% threshold to incomes over 100,000. That's a very long-term but doable projection. If you do that, that would mean that the bulk of people in Britain paid 20% income tax rate. That is the best I think you can do. The second tax cuts to be introduced in the first term of a Conservative centre-right reform, whatever it is, Parliament, would be corporation tax, reduce that back down to 15%. And I set out how to do that. You need to do it from the current rate down to 15%. And the third cut you need to make in the first 5 years is the VAT. VAT was introduced at 8% when we joined the EU. It's now at a ruinous 20%. It's an insanely high rate. I outline how you reduce it incrementally over the first 5-year term of a parliament down to 15%. The long-term aim for that should be to turn it into a local sales tax, but that's not something you would attempt to do in your first 5 years. Now, if you did all of that, control public spending and cut taxes the way I propose, you would basically, by the end of 5 years, have put the books in better order. You would be narrowing the deficit. You would be on a trajectory to eventually eliminate it. And you would be creating the conditions of growth. And this is the key. Once you start to see the growth, the numbers all turn out to be wrong because they turn out to be way pessimistic. Growth is what means that suddenly, if you cut VAT and you cut corporation tax, a year or two down the line, revenues will exceed projections. Now, that's how you do it. And it will be very, very difficult. The first 5-year parliament of a centre-right government will be incredibly tough because you'll be making these decisions and the green shoots of recovery won't yet be visible. But once they become visible, after 2 or 3 years, that's when the country will begin to get back on its feet.
I think it's absolutely fascinating and I think a really, really interesting proposal. One question I have is, I think that we can't talk about public spending and cutting public spending in the UK without talking about pensions. What do you think is the solution then in the long term, especially as we've got an ageing population? As you know, we spend double the amount of the entire budget of the Ministry of Defence on pensions alone. And of course, with public sector pensions, there are huge liabilities. I'm sure some of that would be cut under your plans if the size of the state.
I wrote the plan with some nod to political pragmatism. I deliberately didn't include pensions. I think if you look at the numbers in the plan, I'm being honest and frank as to what can and can't be done. But I didn't touch pensions because I think that in order to build the coalition that you need to win this, you have to. It pains the libertarian in me, but you have to. You have to accept that there are some vested interests that you shouldn't take on, and I wouldn't touch the farmers. And I wouldn't touch the pensioners. You need those two blocks to be elemental to a new centre-right coalition. So I know it's a deep imperfection as a free marketeer, but I wouldn't touch that.
Okay, interesting. And so we've got cuts to public spending, and then we have reductions in the tax rate. What else do you outline in your plan that will then result in a hopefully more prosperous Britain?
Planning reform. Hammersmith Bridge, near where I used to live in London, has been closed because they found some cracks in it. Now, this is a bridge that was built by Victorians in a couple of years, over a century ago. It has been shut because they found these cracks in it for 8 years. That, to me, is a metaphor for everything that's wrong with the country. I mean, the capital city of Britain, we cannot do what the Victorians were capable of doing.
As a result of regulation?
As a result of regulation and just general sort of everyone's in charge, everybody's in charge, and so no one's in charge, and so nothing happens. I mean, it's madness, absolute madness. And it's like that with housing developments. I mean, since when was it a good idea to insist that when someone wants to invest private capital in a housing development, that a certain portion of the houses should be reserved for people on benefits? I mean, I'm sorry, this is insane. I don't want to live in a neighbourhood where social engineers have decided what percentage of people on benefits should live in my street. Where do we get this idea from? So get rid of all those restrictions and don't be defensive about it. Get rid of the restrictions on planning. If you create a capital city and you create a donut of restriction around it called the Green Belt, and there are bits of the Green Belt that don't frankly look very green to me, vast swathes of South Essex would be suitable for development. If you create a donut of restriction around the capital city and then allow in large numbers of people to come in, what are you going to do? You're going to create a capital city in which young people in their 20s have no chance of owning a property. It's madness.
And it
madness.
has those political implications as well. What's interesting about
the sociological implications.
Yes.
One of the reasons why historically people have moved to cities is to seek their fortune. The tale of Dick Whittington. And it's not just their career fortune, it's to find their partner. This is sociologically, this is why people move to cities in their youth and move out of cities when they've found their partner and established a little bit of capital. One of Britain's problems is that in our capital city, that isn't functioning anymore. And you can see it visibly in London. Places that I remember 10 years ago being thriving, full of young people, celebrating the end of a hard day, mingling with prospective partners or whatever, they're gone, they're shut, they're gone. It's not just a hang-up of lockdowns. You've created a capital city in England that is reminiscent of an airport lounge. It has all the civic appeal and charm and buy-in of Heathrow Airport. You've created a giant Heathrow Airport. And this is why the country is dysfunctional. Create a radical transformation of planning so that people can build houses, where they want to have them, allow young Britons, not through some government handout scheme, but through the free market, to have the chance of owning a property. And that's how you put the country back on its feet.
It's absolutely fascinating. I think specifically with regard to capital cities and also the psyche. I mean, there is the political implications. So there is that old adage, if you're 18, you're not a socialist, you've got no heart. And if you're 30, not a conservative, you have no brain. That transition towards conservatism, or indeed towards a feeling as though you have a stake in society, is not happening anymore. And that's
getting a mortgage that makes the change.
Exactly.
Totally.
It's having a stake in society. It's being able to own property that fundamentally is.
Totally. And, I really worry about people that I know who are, 30 years younger than me, living in London. And I think, how do they cope? How do they put up with it? I mean, the odds are stacked against them. The best they can hope for is to live in some dreadful identikit apartment with paper-thin walls that has been, come on, we also, I think, have to talk as free marketeers about something we've not really been good at talking about in the past, which is demographics. I suspect one of the reasons why there's been a collapse in birth rates is because what are the chances of being able to raise a family in a capital city where housing costs are ruinous? You can't have the space, you can't own the property, you can't put aside a bit of capital. What's been good for it's a disaster. You need radical planning reform.
I think as a Brit that's moved to the US, you're well aware of the fact that you can buy much bigger property over in the US with the money that you have in the UK. Absolutely. And we've been talking for a very long time, and I don't want to take up too much of your time today, Douglas. But finally, before we finish up, I wanted to ask what your personal advice would be for policymakers that are listening to this right now. If you could tell any British politician that is sat across over there in Parliament right now one piece of advice, what would it be?
When Thatcher was trying to restore the country, she faced fundamentally an economic problem. And the agenda she came up with, stepping stones, the strategy came up, stepping stones to address that, was focused on economics. I think the challenge today is far greater because it's not just an economic malaise, it's a moral and cultural malaise. The country is coming apart because it's been governed by a class, the Blairite class, who believe in the universality of the human condition, that humans are interchangeable. And this has created a demoralization. It's demoralized the country. You have public museums funded by the taxpayer that give lectures and scold about the iniquities of Britain and Britain's history. You've had this great undermining of confidence in the West and the Western way of life. So I think my advice to politicians would be, yes, come up with plans to rein in public spending, come up with plans to dramatically remove planning restrictions, come up with all of these key things. And I'm disappointed that Kemi Badenoch doesn't seem to talk about the economy at all, but also talk about some of these cultural issues. There is a forgotten country out there, a country that used to be thought of as blue-collar and slightly chavvy, but it's not. It has been derided and sneered at and mocked for a generation, and it's had enough, and it wants its country back. Speak to that country. Reform is doing well, I think, because it's not just tapping into economic discontent, but a discontent of a forgotten people who are increasingly middle class as well. And I think you have to find a way of pushing back against the universalist capture of our institutions. You need to begin to unashamedly push back against it. We need to find a way of celebrating Britishness and British exceptionalism beyond trite references to tolerance. And we need to find a way of doing this, I think, fairly urgently, because if you're a mainstream politician and you're just talking about GDP growth, you're missing the point. There is a resentment amongst a large number of English people who feel that they have been ignored, demoralized, and treated with contempt. And the internet means they're not going to keep their views private anymore. They're not going to hold back. And I think anyone looking to get into government needs to recognize that.
Douglas, as always, it's absolutely fascinating to hear from you, and I'm sure that there's a lot there to ponder about and think about. If any of you would like to watch or listen to more of the IA's content, then do check out insider.iea.org.uk, and you can check out Milestones over on your Substack. Is that right?
Substack, or just Google it. Douglas Carswell Milestones. It's free.
Amazing. Thank you so much.